It is 6:30, and it is time for us to get started with our Pastor's Bible Study for, what is the date today? For March 10th, 2021. We are in the midst of Lent. Can you turn me down a hair? I feel like I'm blowing people out. Okay, there we go. That's better. So we're in the Lenten season. I think we're just a couple of weeks out now from Palm Sunday and Holy Week and ultimately Easter. This Lenten season, we have been, each Sunday, we've been looking at one of the 7 last words of Christ. And, well, hey, here comes the O'Connors. Come on in. And so so far we've looked at, the first one was, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And these are the 7 sayings that we find scattered through all 4 of the Gospels. And because each of them tell a little bit different story or kind of come at it from a little different angle. The second one was when he speaks to the thief on the cross saying, today you will be with me in paradise. So that week we looked at the meta-narrative of paradise and reconciliation and how God started off with Adam and Eve in the garden, and there was that perfect intimate relationship, and how that's ultimately God's goal is reconciliation with all God's children. We saw that. We talked about Abraham and blessing all the families of the earth through him. We saw how Jesus was the fullest revelation of that. Then last week we looked at where Jesus says to Mary and to his beloved disciple John, woman, behold your son, son, behold your mother. And last week we looked at the 5th commandment rather. Here's the Hasses. Welcome, thank you for being here. We looked at that, and we looked at the 5th commandment to honor your father and mother, and we talked about those family relationships. We also talked about how dysfunctional families can be and how God has given us a new family in Jesus Christ. And we see that dramatically illustrated when Jesus says to his mother, hey, I'm not turning you over to one of my siblings, I'm turning you over to one of my disciples. And so we see that we have something new in the church, a new community, a new family. And today we're on to the 5th of Jesus' final words, which is captured in the Gospel of Mark. And what I always try to do is, as I'm studying, and usually on Wednesdays, I've said this before, I'm kind of in the thick of my sermon preparation. So I've spent a lot of time with the text and also thinking about how the text connects with the broader story, with the bigger story. And that has been the pattern for this particular Bible study now from the very beginning. So I look for the scholarly phrase to describe it is meta-narratives. And there are all kinds of meta-narratives, which are bigger narratives or storylines or threads, if you want to call it that, or themes that run through Scripture. And the last word that we're going to be talking about tonight is when Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which we're going to discover is actually a direct quote from the very first verse of Psalm 22. So we're going to be reading all of Psalm 22, and you'll see why here in a minute. But as I was pulling on the thread from this last final word of Jesus, it occurred to me that there were multiple kind of meta-narratives or themes that are running through this, that run through Scripture. For instance, one that came to mind right away is the idea of sin and deliverance from sin. So we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. We're also going to talk about pride, and humility. Pride is ultimately often what is at the heart of sin. So let me just give you an example. So I always wind up at some point going back to Genesis and beginning the story there somewhere early in Scripture. What was the sin of Adam and Eve? What would you describe the sin of Eve? What was it? Other than disobedience, what was it? That was the consequence. That was
They wanted to be equal.
they wanted to be like God. So God said, you can eat from any tree in the garden, but you can't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that's a little confusing to us, but what that meant was knowledge of everything. From good to evil, from A to Z, from soup to nuts, from good to evil. That's what that meant. And that's what the serpent said to Eve. Hey, if you eat this, you can be like God. And he doesn't want you to be like him. So maybe this is something, look, it's good to eat too.
What was her sin? Envy or greed?
I think ultimately seeking to be God, I would put pride, power in there, seeking that. I mean, look at the prehistory of Israel ends in Genesis 11 with the story of the Tower of Babel. What were they trying to do? Storm heaven, right? They're going to build a tower. They're going to say, look how smart we are, look how powerful we are. We're going to storm heaven. God says, not having any of that, and confuses the language and separates them to the ends of the earth. And then in the very next chapter, we begin with Abraham. God said, we're going to start with one family, and through that family, we're going to be a blessing to all the families of the earth, not just to the Jewish people, not just to the chosen people, but to all the families of the earth. And we often come back to that when we look at these meta narratives. Another meta narrative that came to mind, as we're going to see, is the idea of redemptive suffering, and again deliverance from sin as a result of that. So we've come back again and again. I think I could read Isaiah 53 at every one of these Bible studies, which is, we've looked at it at least twice in the last couple of weeks. Isaiah 53 is the suffering servant song, where it talks about by his wounds we are healed. He's taken the sin of the people on himself. By his suffering we are saved. That's right there. It's an exile. It's from that time when Israel finally learned their lesson about pride, about power, about turning and trusting in things other than God. They were truly humbled. They were truly humbled when that suffering servant song came about. And we know that Jesus saw himself in that suffering servant song, and we know that he saw himself in Psalm 22, which is why those words are on his lips as he's being crucified, as he is dying. So I thought I would start in an interesting place. Rather than starting in Genesis, I thought I would start tonight in Romans, because what we see here is we see Paul wrestling with the idea of Adam and how sin came through the first man, and how redemption and salvation has now come through Jesus, the second Adam. And he develops this whole theology in Romans around this. And I'm going to read it in the NRSV. I know some of you are reading in the today's English version, which is a much simpler translation. And I want to hear what these verses sound like in the TEV, because this is dense. I guess I would describe it as really dense and hard to understand probably in any translation, but you'll get the idea. Okay, so Paul's writing in Romans 5, beginning of verse 12. Therefore, just as sin came into the world through